ventricular fold. So that eventually forms a bulboventricular fold. And as the bulbar cordis continue to grow, it descends, and we now have a descending and an ascending part of the primitive ventricle and also the bulbar cordis. So these parts, we have what we refer to as a high positioning. It means this part, which is the inflow tract, now comes to lie close to the outflow tract. So that these two parts eventually becomes the base of the heart. And the primitive ventricle will expand and form the apex of the heart, a mature heart. We also have looping towards the right. It's a rotational loop towards the right, and this looping towards the right now brings the descending part limb of the primitive ventricle that differentiates from the left ventricle. The ascending part forms the right ventricle, and then the primitive atria develops to form a common atria. All these have a common lumen, and then the truncus arteriosus eventually develops to form the aortic and pulmonary artery. The aortic and pulmonary artery. Now, this is very important because sometimes instead of looping towards the right, there's looping towards the left. So there's a rotation which is going to the wrong direction. And that is very important. Now, since this loop has formed, what happens inside? We need to note here that we have the inflow tract. The inflow tract receives blood from three sources. It receives blood from the umbilical vein, from the placenta. It receives blood from the vitelline vein. Vitelline vein is from the yolk sac. Vitelline vein is from the yolk sac, and later on it is from the digestive tract, digestive system. And then it receives blood also from the cardinal vein, which drains the rest of the body. So that is the blood that comes to the inflow tract at the sinus venosus. The outflow tract is a common opening that now sends blood to the aortic, to the aorta, dorsal and ventral aorta, and also eventually the pulmonary artery. But we are going to see how that takes place. We have the sinus venosus. And if you remember here, sinus venosus is where all the blood drains into. It receives blood from the three sources we have talked about. So what happens to this sinus venosus? We have said there is a rotation, a looping of the heart towards the right. As a result of this looping towards the right, there's a shifting of the inflow tract to the right. The shifting of inflow tract to the right. So the right sinus venosus horn will become enlarged, and the left right venosus horn becomes less enlarged and eventually disappears. So the right sinus horn eventually develops to form the inferior vena cava. Now the superior vena cava will originate from the trunk of the cardinal vein. Remember we talked about cardinal vein? Cardinal veins drain blood in the embryo, both from the right and left part of the body, from the tissues, both of the right and left part of the body. And these cardinal veins, because of the shifting also of the looping of the heart tube, we now have the right trunk developing more and develops to form the superior vena cava. So most of the blood is going to now come through the superior vena cava. We are going to see the pulmonary artery and vein coming later on. Now, the sinus venosus has a small part which is not incorporated now into that, and that becomes coronary sinus that receive blood from the wall of the heart. So the coronary sinus receives blood from the wall of the heart, both from the right atrium, left atrium, the ventricles, all of it come and collect at the coronary sinus before emptying into the right atrium. Having looked at the blood getting in, we have a common wall, common tube, common ventricle, common atria. But we said the heart has got 4 chambers. We said there are 2 atria, 2 ventricles. Initially, we just have a common lumen for both. We then have what we refer to as septation of the heart, divisions of the heart into the 4 chambers. For the atrium, this part here is what we are referring to as to atrioventricular plane, what I talked about, atrioventricular plane between the atria and the ventricles. Between the atria and the ventricles, we have some of the cells from the neurocrest cells. Neurocrest cells migrating into this area and proliferating below the endothelium and bulge into the lumen. So these cells then constitute what would now divide the atria and the ventricles, but we're going to look at that later on. We have the common atria. We have a membrane growing towards from the upper part towards the valve plane or the atrioventricular canal, the common canal here, atrioventricular canal. And that is what we refer to as the septum primum, the first septa that is dividing the atria into 2 parts, right and left atrium. This septum primum grows towards the atrioventricular canal, where you have these endocardial cushions that have developed, that have bulged into the lumen. It leaves a very small opening. Just before that, it leaves a very small opening, and that opening is we refer to as ostium primum. First as ostium primum. And immediately before it attaches to the cushion at the atrioventricular canal, we have a second septum, which we refer to as the septum secundum. A second septum developing, septum secundum, which grows towards the atrioventricular canal. But like we said, just before the septum primum reaches the atrioventricular canal, there is hallowing of blood in the upper part of the septum primum. And that hallowing will have created ostium primum. We then have a second septum growing towards the atrioventricular canal, that is septum secundum, and does not completely attach to the atrioventricular canal. It leaves a space. That is referred to as the ostium secundum. Ostium secundum. But we had the hallowing of the ostium primum, and therefore there's a creation of a hole between the right atrium and the right atrium. This creation of the hole is what we refer to as foramen ovale. It's oval-shaped foramen because of the hollowing of the septum primum. You will also notice that the base of this is formed by the septum primum. So in the adult, we'll be able to identify this region as a depression that we refer to as the fossa ovalis. Fossa ovalis. And this fossa ovalis represents where the opening of the foramen ovale was. And the floor of the fossa ovalis is formed by the septum primum. Septum primum. We also have another valve, the septum spurium, that eventually forms part of the valve of the vena cava. But forget about that for now. Just remember we have a septum primum, septum secundum, dividing the atria into two parts, the right atrium and the left atrium, but leaving a common opening through which blood passes from the right to the left, bypassing the ventricle. We then have this common area here. There is rapid growth of these neurocrest cells, pushing the endocardium into the lumen. So that almost obliterates the whole of this area. But because blood is moving in, it causes some hollowing of the connective tissue of the both endocardium and the connective tissue in this area, forming some sort of perforations. This hollowing then creates what you refer to as the valves, the tricuspid valve and the bicuspid valve. Is created by the hollowing of the blood as it moves through the common atrium and the ventricle. So we have this completely closed. Eventually the ostium secundum, ostium primum, and then the atrioventricular canal being separated into right and left. And then on the right, you have the development of the tricuspid valve. On the left, you have development of the bicuspid valve. So that is how the atria is divided into right and left atria. What can go wrong? Sometimes the septum primum does not completely reach this part here. So it leaves a big hole. So we refer to that as ostium primum defect. Or the secundum does not also reach in this position. So we refer to that as ostium secundum defect. But very commonly, we normally have the foramen ovale being open, and therefore we have a patent foramen ovale as a defect. What about the ventricles? What happens in the ventricles? In the ventricles, we have usually right and left ventricle, but we have a common ventricle. So the lumen of the common ventricle, we have growth of the endocardial cushions. Endocardial cushions, which are neurocrest derived. These endocardial cushions grow towards the midline. They grow towards the midline and separate the ventricle into two parts, right and left ventricle. So that part becomes the muscular part of the interventricular septum. the interventricular septum. Then we have this other part where we also have some cushions, but extensions from the valve canal, from the cushions in the valve canal. This forms the part that we refer to as the membranous part of the interventricular septum. So we have a muscular part and a membranous part. Occasionally, we might have failure of the neurocrist cells to adequately develop within the interventricular, from the interventricular septum. So we have a ventricular septal defect. There's a hole between the two ventricles. Ventricular septal defect is one of the malformations of the heart. Initially, most of the part of the ventricle here will be having a lot of this endocardial cushion growth, projections into the lumen, but because of the movements of blood, it is hollowing. They use the word hollowing. It's like excavation of that wall. So as a result of that excavation, we eventually end up with the chorda tendini formation. Chorda tendini formation connecting the valves to the wall of the heart. Again, the valves were formed by hollowing. Because of this rapid, strong currents created by blood flow, we therefore have development of the rapid from the valves, which are more fibrous to withstand a lot of these pressures. So that is how the ventricle separates into the right and left ventricle. What about the atria? If we go back to the atria, we had noted that the atrium was very close to sinus venosus. So part of the sinus venosus is going to be incorporated into the atria. Most of the smooth part of the right atrium was incorporation from the sinus venosus. So the primitive atria and the part incorporated from the sinus venosus is marked externally by a depression we refer to as the sulcus terminalis, or as a projection into the lumen that we refer to as the crista terminalis. So in the right atrium, you will have the smooth part will be originating from the sinus venosus, and the rough part, which contains muscular pectinati, will be part of the primitive atrium. On the other hand, on the left part, the left atria, most of the left atria, except for a very small part, except for the auricle, is usually smooth. And it is the part that is incorporated from the pulmonary vessels, the pulmonary vein. Part of the pulmonary vein will be incorporated to form the wall of the left atrium. What about the outflow tract? We have the outflow tract, which is truncus arteriosus. The outflow tract, to remember, is going to be connected to the aortic arches. We have the aorta, the aortic arches. It's also going to the pulmonary artery. So the outflow tract is a common tubular structure, and we have some cushions, neurocrist cells developing within the wall, forming a septa that grows towards the lumen. This growth of the neuronucleus cells forms a complete septa, separating the outflow tract into the aorta and the pulmonary artery. Aorta and pulmonary artery. During this development, we have some rotation, some spiraling of the common truncus arteriosus, and this rotation eventually leads to the part that developed to form the aorta, originating directly from the left ventricle. And the other part that is pulmonary is from the right ventricle. It is spiraling. So we have a aorticopulmonary membrane, that separates the primitive aorta and the pulmonary artery from what was commonly the truncus arteriosus. Occasionally, we might have incomplete spiraling,